Welcome to A Novel Talk. I'm Wendy Kendall, a cozy mystery and middle grade mystery writer, and half of the duo bringing you our regular podcast series, talking with fascinating novelists writing across a variety of genres. And here is your co host.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm Carl Lee. I write paranormal fantasy, but I enjoy reading a wide range of genres, including a good mystery.
Join us today for a novel talk with Glen Erik Hamilton. Our guest started his Van Shaw mystery series with a bang, winning all these: the Anthony, the McCavity, and the Strand Magazine Critics Awards. He's recently released his exciting fourth novel in the series, Mercy River. He's president of the Southern California chapter of the Mystery Writers Association. I met him a few years ago at a library fundraising event in Seattle, his childhood hometown. I'm so excited that he agreed to join us today. Welcome to A Novel Talk, Glen Erik Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Wendy and Carl. It's great to be on your new podcast, and I'm very delighted to be one of the first guests.
Ooh, well, we're glad you're here. Congratulations on your most recent book, Mercy River. It's a suspenseful mystery that kept me guessing through every clue and thrilling development. I share with your readers a fascination with Van Shaw. This protagonist of yours is a troubled, well-intentioned veteran who was raised by his grandfather to be a thief, and very good at that, by the way. But Van is out to do good, although, as Van puts it himself, he is surrounded by trouble and crime and threat. What was your inspiration for this character? And do you like Van Shaw? I mean, would he be a friend of yours?
Would Van be a friend of mine? Let me start with that one. He's not a guy who makes friends terribly easy. Not that he's unfriendly, but he's been raised to be, as you can understand, being raised by a career criminal. He's been raised to be a pretty private guy. He holds things close to the vest, and I don't know that he's that forthcoming in terms of making friends. He's the friendships that he's made so far outside of the military have been few and far between, and are usually around shared experience. Often that means a shared criminal experience as well. As far as the inspiration for Van, the genesis of him was being curious about what it would be like if someone was raised with a very different setting on their moral compass. If they were raised in a criminal environment and just had that. And I didn't necessarily want to write about an anti-hero, for one thing. So it was necessary for that person to confront their darker upbringing and perhaps their darker nature. I was also always a fan of the Richard Stark Parker novels. And for those who might not be aware, Richard Stark was a pseudonym of Donald E. Westlake, one of the great crime writers of all time. And Westlake was remarkably prolific. And as Richard Stark, he wrote these adventures of a career criminal called Parker, who was primarily a robber and thief. Parker was essentially, if not sociopathic, really close to it. He was entirely about the business. He had a bit of a code of ethics. He wouldn't double-cross anybody who hadn't double-crossed him first, but he was utterly ruthless. And I started thinking about, well, what would it be like to be raised by Parker? And that was another seed that sort of was the genesis of the idea. Ultimately, Dono, Van's grandfather, who raised him, is not Parker. He's perhaps a little deeper than that character. I don't mean to offend any fans of the Parker novels, but Parker is an extremely straightforward character for the most part. Dono is a little more complex in terms of his emotions and reactions and what he does and does not do and how he raises Van, with his own version of love. And so out of those two ideas came Van Shaw.
Wow, cool.
Yeah, a very cool character, most definitely. And this book kept me guessing as well. I'm not as experienced at solving mysteries as Wendy, but You make a lot of references to very specific military devices, specific guns, knives, explosive devices. Do you have personal experience with that, or is this research you've done? What was your approach to researching this book if it was based on research?
Sure. Yeah, I don't have a lot of personal experience in my background. Although as I tend to research the books, I gain a little bit. Right. I'll go out and I'll do a little homework and find out about things. Most of it is research. It usually starts off with reading about as much as I can about stuff, or seeing what I can find online, because you can find a remarkable amount on YouTube and other channels these days.
Yes.
But that can't be where you stop if you want to get it right. And so I usually interview people in the know, whether that's law enforcement, whether that's former special operations folks themselves. I have a couple of folks that I run pages by in terms of specifically the Ranger lore. And some of it's the specifics on hardware and equipment and munitions and what they use. Some of it is just the way of thinking. I will run an action scene, especially a big action scene, and there's a couple of those in Mercy River, past the Rangers and the veterans that I know, and ask them, is he thinking about this the right way? Is this the way somebody who was trained tactically? And they make no bones about it. Training is what they do constantly, so that reaction in a dangerous and a chaotic situation becomes automatic, in a way that is likely to save their life and the life of the person next to them. So knowing how Van is going to react in a given situation is based largely on the input that I get from those knowledgeable sources.
Interesting.
Wow. That's a lot of legwork, but boy, does it pay off in those action scenes. They're riveting.
Thank you.
Well, I love the way in your writing that you create vivid but sometimes contrasting descriptions. So, for example, in Mercy River, there's this quote: "I could already feel a growing energy in the town, like kids before summer vacation, or maybe animals before an earthquake." That's such a great contrast. Is there a method that you use for developing engaging visuals like this? And here's a quiz for you. If we had invited Van Shaw to join us instead of you for a novel talk, how do you think he would describe his feeling about recording his episode?
Van's he's not prone to sharing. There's a reason that the books are written in first person, is because he's not a guy who, we can learn his thoughts, but he may not vocalize those thoughts necessarily a lot. He would probably phrase it as he'd rather be punched in the throat than share his feelings openly on the podcast.
Wow.
But yeah. So he's not completely closed off either. He's a guy who's, he's had and is currently having therapy, understands the benefits of doing so, for dealing and for finding tools, which is the way he would think about it, right? He's like, I've got problem, I've got nightmares, I've got other things that I need to deal with. What are the tools that I can use to fix this? That is the way he's going to think about that problem, right?
Yeah.
So, as far as developing engaging, I'm going to change the language a little bit. You say engaging visuals, but really it's all your senses, right? It's we tend to describe things first visually, cinematically, and we kind of want to know what the room looks like when we first walk in, because that's the first impression that we have of it. But if you really want to feel it, then you want to know how that room smells. You want to know what the ambient sounds are. You want to know how long it feels since a person's been in that room recently, right? Is it a welcoming space? Is it a cold space? Is it a space that gives you the creeps? Because Van's been in a couple of those too, and there's no particular reason that space should be any creepier than any other, but he gets the vibe, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what you want. You want that whenever your characters enter a new place, be that a town like Mercy River or something else, you want that feeling. What is that? And since Mercy River, when he's there, he doesn't know why, but it's gearing up for the rally, for this huge event, and it's got that, it's almost Christmas kind of feel, only maybe the Christmas isn't quite as fun as Christmas is, right?
So I love Van. That character is just so intriguing to me. But I was just wondering, is Van alone because he's broken? I love damaged heroes. Or is he alone because he loves Luce enough simply to let her go?
I don't know that Van would describe himself as broken. He knows who he is, or he's coming to realize who he is. Part of the fun of this is that Van is still a young guy. He entered the military at 18. He served for about 10 years. He's now pushing 30 since he's been out of the military, and he's still growing as a person. And of course, almost his entire adult life has been spent in the auspices of the military. And the military takes care of a lot of things for you, right? So you can concentrate on other things. So he never expected to live as long as he has. And I describe Van as an expert in surviving and a rookie at living.
Nice.
Right? So he's figuring out what he needs to be, and what he can't be right now is a straight citizen. He's not a criminal, but he's perfectly fine using some of those methods to obtain what he feels is the right thing to do, right? And so I do think Van understands that Luce, by benefit of their shared background and both of them having childhoods, in the life, and Luce becoming probably as ethical a person as is humanly possible because of that, he realizes that there's no way that they can be functional together as a couple.
Right. Excellent.
Well, at one point, two of your characters, Macomber and Luce, have this exchange. Macomber said to Luce, "What brings you to the wilderness of Oregon besides Sergeant Shaw?" "A friend in need," she said. He answers, "The best reason of all, wonderful." Why is the theme of friendship one of the important themes that you write about in Mercy River?
Well, yeah, it is. Friendship is largely one of the underlying themes of the book. I don't really decide on what the theme of a book is before I've written it. I generally write it, and then somehow my subconscious has given it a theme, and then in rewrites I go and I reinforce that.
Oh, wow.
Right? Figure out what that is. It's that weird magic that happens when you write. Things come out that you weren't thinking about when you were drafting. But I'd not had, although Van has described some of his military experiences before, this is the fourth book, and it's the first one where we go into some detail on his early life, or in those early stages of becoming a ranger, of the selection process of RASP and the ranger school, which are two different experiences. And it's the first book in which he's been surrounded by people who have that shared experience and are of like mind, and who'll know what he's talking about when he talks about those things. And that's a bond that never really goes away, regardless of generation or whether or not you served with this particular brother in the Rangers. It's, you have that shared experience and that shared understanding. And it just formed a natural foundation for exploring what friendship means, especially when that friendship is betrayed. When someone's not living up to what you expect it to be.
Beautiful.
So, speaking of Macomber, I was thinking about those exciting scenes after Van leaves Macomber's house, and in Macomber's house and in the ghost town. That whole sequence there. What do you do? What techniques do you use to write so well and keep track of all of these people who are traveling at different speeds and going from different origin places? to make sure that everyone is where they need to be when they need to be there, without making it sound like the cavalry coming at the last minute, which is kind of hokey and contrived.
It can be definitely. Yeah. Well, some of it is because the events happen, I hope, because I've thought about the characters enough, I've given them enough life and agency that they're doing something when they're off the page, right? When they're out there, they're not just sitting in the wings waiting to jump in, a week later, and you're like, wait, that guy's still in town? Wait a minute. So, if I've thought about a character, even a minor one, sufficiently, I have a reasonable idea of how they fill their days and what it is they do, and if they're an active part of the story, if they're one of the antagonists or even a supporting character, I usually know what they want, and what they're doing when they're off the page is pursuing what they want, and if their pursuit of what they want is going to bring them back into Van's focus, then that is what happens next in the story, right? So although sometimes it's a matter of I've set up a scene and I need to have this character get there. There is a little reverse engineering that happens because of that, certainly.
Right.
But some of it is you're writing reasonably organically, and I sort of am a hybrid between plotting and pantsing. I usually have an idea of where I want the characters to go, and if I'm thinking about, well, what's that character doing while Van's doing this, then it sort of naturally leads often into, well, they're going to cross paths in about 6 hours then. And then that leads into, hopefully, that scene. Sometimes it is a logic puzzle game. It is me standing there in front of a large whiteboard, or pacing around the room going, all right, if this guy's here and she's there, and Van knows this, then what happens next? Wait a minute. So that's the fun of designing mysteries is like any other puzzle. You've got to start from the solution and work backwards a little bit.
Excellent.
Speaking about that, what is it that attracts you to writing mysteries over other genres?
Mm-hmm. Well, there is a certain matter of write what you know, of course. I grew up reading mysteries, as a lot of us did. I grew up raiding my parents' collections of mysteries and thrillers, and that's always what attracted me. And there's a reason I think that mysteries are, when you take all of the different varieties into account, easily the most popular type of fiction in the world. Bar none. Romance sells a tremendous amount, no doubt. But if you include all of the different varieties of mysteries and thrillers and adventures, that is a really dominant force. And I think there's a reason for that. We want to know the unknown, right? We want to be presented with something, an exciting question, or something that's hard to puzzle out, or an adventure, or a tough situation. And we want to see the characters navigate that, for good or ill, right? And so, that's fascinating. And I was a kid who liked puzzles, who liked logic problems, who liked stuff like that. And I don't know whether the mysteries came first and then the puzzles, or the puzzles came first and then the mysteries. But it is a matter of writing what you like to read and what you know. I'm sure, from time to time I delve into elements of the books that aren't necessarily about the mystery. They aren't solely plot driven. There's character moments too, and that's where it maybe gets closer to something like literary fiction. But you could also argue that almost all fiction has an element of mystery to it, because we always want to know what this interesting person is likely to do next.
Oh, good point.
So, what propelled your decision to include antagonists that are neo-Nazis in the plot? It seemed odd.
It seemed odd to have neo-Nazis?
It did. To me, it was like, oh, well, that's a good idea.
Okay. Well, there's a couple good reasons. One is, and I don't, to be clear, I'm a Pacific Northwest guy. I was born around Seattle and raised in that environment, and we went all over the state when I was a kid a lot, and Oregon as well. And there is, in some areas of America, and Pacific Northwest is one of them, in small town America, there is a strong rise in right-wing nationalism. You know, it's inane to pretend that doesn't exist.
Right.
Not every town has it. Most towns don't. Most towns actively resist it. But there are cases in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere where the influence of white supremacy is a large contributing factor to that environment. You know, there have been cases where those factors have attempted to take over towns politically, right? By forcing their way through violence and other means into town politics, and in order to establish themselves as a growing power. And I found that scary and fascinating. I'm also because I'm dealing with Van and I'm dealing with his life around criminals, it's kind of fascinating to also have bad guys and really bad guys. Right. You know, there's guys who'll bend the law, there's guys who'll break the law, and there's guys who want to burn everything down and recreate the world in their own image. You know, no matter who that hurts, and especially if it hurts the people they want it to hurt. Right. So that to me provided an antagonist that was serious enough and dangerous enough that it could conceivably go up against, not to have any spoilers, but could conceivably go up against other factors in this story, right? Including Van.
Yes, very exciting choice.
What is the importance of setting? How do you pick the settings for your books? And with all the small towns in the Pacific Northwest, why create a mythic town of Mercy River in Oregon?
Sure. Well, that leads naturally from the last question of if you're going to have a neo-Nazi influence in a town, there's some advantages to making that town fictional. Right?
Oh, I see. Yes.
And even the county fictional. But there's other reasons too. One is just because I get to play God when you're writing fiction, and I get to invent this town. I get to take, for example, some of the more dramatic scenery in Central Oregon, and there's a lot of it, and push that together closer to Mercy River and this particular fictional county of Griffin County, and use that. You know, I can use the volcanic fields, obsidian fields that are a little more south and west of where this might be. I can use the buttes that are along the John Day River, which are very dramatic. You know, I can have all of those features and push them together without offending any locals who will say, well, that's 60 miles away. You can't have that there. Mm-hmm. And I note that in the acknowledgments, and I say, I take both full responsibility and full rights to play with geography however I see fit. Another reason is jurisdiction. Especially when you're dealing with small town law enforcement, that could be under the county, that could be under a local police department. You could have a mix of the two, as we do here. And I think there's an innate deal you're striking with the reader when you create a fictional place and you have law enforcement in that fictional place. If I were to pick a real town, let's say I picked Prineville, for example, and I had it set there, the reader might be less prone to suspecting there's something off about the local law enforcement if I'm talking about a real police department, right? Uh-huh. Whereas if it's fictional, all the possibilities are open, right? You know, are these, can Van trust these cops or not? And it puts the reader a little closer to Van's mindset because of that. Because Van doesn't trust cops, generally speaking. He wasn't raised to trust cops. He was raised as a crook. Yeah. So it allows the reader to think a little bit more like Van does and essentially look for corruption first. He'll go in assuming they're corrupt before he knows different.
That's it. I'm moving my next book outside of Seattle to Windyville.
Windyville. I love it.
At one point, you have Van playing poker in the Mercy River,
Mm-hmm.
and he comments that, or he thinks, my grandfather once told me you can learn more about a man from playing 3 hands of cards than 3 hours of talking to him. Have you ever played cards with Van or any of your other characters, and what did you learn from him?
Oh, that's a great question. I've never played poker with them. I've had conversations, and I suppose you could look at poker as a form of conversation of very limited sorts. I have never thought about how the characters necessarily would play poker. You know, Van knows himself well enough and has played enough cards to know that he's not necessarily great at it. But he's also willing to lose money to learn about the other person, and that's essentially what he's doing in this scene, right? Mm-hmm. He's not in it trying to win the game. He's in it trying to figure out specific things, and especially who around the table might know what. And so he's playing a different sort of game along the way. You know, the poker game exists in Mercy River for a couple of reasons. But mostly, you know, I'm playing a lot with Western tropes in Mercy River, as you could probably tell. The town itself has kind of an Old West facade on the main street that it uses for tourism purposes. We have saloons, we have poker games, we have gunslingers, right, and quick draw, which is one of the games that the shooting competitions that the Rangers have arranged as part of the rally. You know, there's a lot of playing with Old West tropes here, and it just felt right to have a scene set around a poker table and to have a saloon set up for that.
And it worked very well.
Yes.
It blended very well. I was wondering, Glenn, would you treat us and our listeners to a reading from Mercy River?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I'd be delighted. Let's see. The piece I've selected is a short one. I like to read short pieces, generally speaking, and it's early on in the book. It is just after Van has received a voicemail, because he caught it a little too late, from his friend and former Ranger buddy, Leo Pack. And Leo has been arrested for robbery and murder in the town of Mercy River, Oregon, which Van has not visited yet. And so he's still in Seattle at this point. It's chapter 2, and he is in the dead of night, and he's going to enlist a little help along the way. I found the right house, a long modernist structure with 2-story glass windows and artful illumination coming from low spotlights at each corner. Knocked twice and rang the bell. The lamp above me on the front stoop popped to life. "Who is it?" a voice hollered from within. "It's Van, Ephraim." Ephraim Gans opened the door. It was a large door, which seemed Gans appear even smaller by comparison. He wore yellow silk pajamas, perfectly fitted, each cuff the precise length for his limbs. As if in contrast, his sparse gray hair stood up in electric tendrils from sleep. "Sorry to wake you," I said. "I don't believe you are. What the hell, kid?" I let him have the kid. Ephraim Gans had been my grandfather's criminal lawyer since before I could remember. Even now, edging out of middle age and into his senior years, Gans had energy enough to power his whole mansion if you stuck plugs in his ears. "You remember Leo Pack," I said. "He's been arrested for murder and robbery in Mercy River, Oregon." Gans grunted. "Come in." "Honey?" a woman called as I stepped inside the foyer. The very grand foyer, 2 stories and a staircase. I glanced up past the railing to see a flushed and pretty face with ash-blonde ringlets framing it. Her eyes widened at the sight of me, and she tugged her blue satin robe a little tighter. "It's all right, baby," Gans said. "Just a client." She didn't seem reassured. Viewing the scene from her side, 4 o'clock in the morning, a big guy dressed like a handyman standing in my front hall, with scars like pale creek beds creasing one full side of his face, I wouldn't feel too secure either. "Ma'am," I said. She frowned a little deeper and disappeared into the shadows of the upper floor. "Third wife's pretty," I said to Gans, too low to be overheard. "You are still on number 3, right?" "Funny," he said. "What's this about your sniper buddy?" He did remember Leo. I told him the situation. He listened without expression, interrupting only to clarify exactly what the deputy had told me. "Arraignments later today, the county cop said. That's not a good sign. They think they can close this fast." "Yeah, I need you down there." He sighed. "Come on." I followed him down a hallway and past a dining room large enough to host the entire platoon Leo and I had served in. The kitchen beyond wasn't quite as ostentatious, only half the size of a tennis court. All of the appliances along the walls were of gleaming burnished steel, a match for the sleek lines of the house. It made the kitchen feel a little like a lab, or a morgue. "Leo," Gans said as he took out a jar of instant coffee and 2 delicate china cups. "He's the one with the troubles, right?" He tapped a fingertip against his temple. "And he's been arrested before?" "Yeah." "You know how this is going to look. The guy is trained to pull a trigger. More than that, he's among the best in the world at it. Special Forces sniper. Special operations. Forces of the Green Berets. We're Rangers." "Pardon moi." He finished stirring and handed me one of the porcelain cups. Loose ground swirled grayly on the surface of the mixture. I looked at Gans. "I got a taste for Sanka in law school," he said. "Living in the coffee capital of the U.S., I drink this." "Get Leo sprung. I'll buy you a tanker truck full of it," I said. "Add 1 and 1, Van. Whatever the hard evidence against Leo is, it's made them bold. And they have to like the story his personal history tells. I would." "You want a plea bargain? Already?" "I want you to temper your expectations. Unless they screwed up the chain of evidence, we got an uphill battle ahead." "So let's go," I said. "I'll send Aaron now. He's good." "Ephraim, how much of a retainer did I give you?" Gans rolled the coffee around in his mouth. "And I never asked how that miracle happened. From all your overtime as a bouncer, I'm sure." "Pack a bag," I said. "What, now?" "Truck's outside." "We're driving?" "God save me. Your grandfather never gave me this much grief. I knew him 30 years. He ran a hand through his wild hair. "Mercy River. God, tell me that name isn't meant as sarcasm."
Awesome.
Yes. Thank you for sharing with us. Van is such a full character, and this was an amazing tale. Every time I thought I had it figured out, you threw another curveball, and I'm like, I'm lost again. It was amazing. It was awesome.
I hope not too lost. It's I tend to, I always think I'm going to write a simple story, and it ends up getting rather complex by the end of it.
Beautifully complex.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Glenn, for joining us for a novel talk. Before we say goodbye, I did want to mention that I saw on your website at glenerikhamilton.com that June 8th and 9th you'll be at the California Crime Writers Conference.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So CCWC, California Crime Writers Conference, is a biennial, every 2-year conference that the SoCal Mystery Writers of America and Sisters in Crime LA join up together to throw a conference focused on writing craft. And so there are panels, there are workshops, there are guest speakers. Our guests of honor this year are Katrina McPherson, the author of the Dandy Gilver mystery series, as well as many dark and twisty standalones, and Tess Gerritsen, who is the author of, among many others, the Rizzoli and Isles mysteries,
Yes.
as well. So we are delighted to have Tess and Katrina joining us this year. We've got other luminaries there and at the various panels, and we're going to have a heck of a good time. So if folks, it's short days before the conference, there are still a handful, and I do mean a handful, of registration spots left the last I checked. So if folks are interested in attending that June 8th and 9th in Culver City near Los Angeles, that would be, we would be love to have you. But if not, look towards 2021 when we'll hold the next one.
Ah, yes, good point. Well, thank you, Glenn, and thank you to our listeners for joining us, Carl Lee and Wendy Kendall, for a novel talk. Remember to subscribe so that you don't miss an episode, and keep reading because a novel read leads to a novel talk.